A Navy SEAL returned to a quiet town by a frozen bay. After inheriting a house that no one in town wanted to talk about. But the moment his German shepherd stepped onto the property, the dog froze, staring at the house as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, Nolan began finding hidden journals, sealed records, and clues to a secret that had been protected for more than 30 years. Then he met Elena, the town's quiet veterinarian, strong, kind, and carrying a past that might be connected to the very same house. The town called the Mercer house strange, yet during the darkest nights it had been the only place where the lights never went out. Now a Navy SEAL, a loyal German shepherd, and a woman searching for the truth are about to uncover a story someone desperately wants buried. After the story, share what part touched you the most. If stories like this mean something to you, please like and subscribe. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, so we can keep creating more stories that inspire, heal, and remind us that truth and courage still matter. The northern road into White Harbor, Minnesota ran along a frozen inlet, where the lake met the forest. In winter, the water hardened into pale blue ice, fractured by long cracks that reflected the sky like broken mirrors. Pine trees stood thick along the shoreline, their dark needles heavy with frost. The wind that came across the bay was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of snow and cold iron. Nolan Mercer drove slowly along the 2-lane road. At 38, Nolan had the kind of build that didn't advertise strength but made it obvious to anyone paying attention. He stood about 6 feet tall, roughly 183, and his frame was compact and disciplined, shaped by years of training rather than vanity. His face was clean-shaven, the skin wind-touched and pale but roughened by colder climates and long deployments. Without a beard to soften it, the structure of his jaw stood out clearly. Square, defined, balanced by high cheekbones and calm gray-blue eyes that seemed to measure everything before reacting. His dark brown hair was cut in a military style, short along the sides, slightly longer on top, longer than regulation SEAL standards but still unmistakably practical. He wore the same clothes he had worn for years. A worn olive-gray tactical combat shirt, its fabric softened by time, the cuffs faintly frayed and the shoulders slightly faded from weather and washing. His combat pants, colored somewhere between earth brown and moss green, bore the small marks of long use, creased knees, sagging cargo pockets that had once carried equipment more serious than car keys. Old military work boots rested steady on the pedals. A weathered military watch sat against his wrist, the face scratched just enough to tell a history. Beside him, occupying the passenger seat as if it belonged there, lay Keir. The German shepherd was 4, maybe 5 years old, in the prime of his strength. His coat carried the classic black and tan pattern, dark saddle along the back and shoulders, fading into warm golden brown along the chest and legs. His ears stood upright and alert even when his body appeared relaxed. Keir was not asleep. He hadn't slept since they crossed into the county line. The dog's amber eyes remained fixed on the frozen water outside the truck window, tracking the passing shoreline with quiet concentration. Nolan noticed, but he didn't comment. Keir had instincts Nolan trusted more than most people's opinions. White Harbor appeared gradually. First the gas station, paint faded and windows fogged with warmth from inside. Then the diner leaning toward the road like an old man trying to listen. Then the cluster of buildings around the small harbor where the frozen lake stretched outward like a sheet of dull steel. Nothing had changed. Or maybe Nolan simply recognized the kind of place where things took longer to change. He parked outside the law office a few minutes before 10. The building stood beside the harbor pier, its wooden siding worn by decades of wind. A brass plate beside the door read, "Law Offices of Daniel Whitaker," the letters slightly dull with age. Keir jumped down from the truck first. His paws landed softly on the gravel. His body tall and steady. He wore a black working harness trimmed with a narrow strip of dark red, a practical piece of equipment Nolan had used with him since training. Keir paused on the sidewalk. His nose lifted slightly, sampling the air. His tail stilled. Not fear. Focus. Nolan stepped beside him and rested a hand, briefly against the dog's shoulder. Easy. Keir glanced back once, acknowledging the touch before continuing forward. Inside, the law office smelled like paper and heating oil. A woman stood behind the reception desk. Sarah Whitaker, Daniel's daughter, had taken over much of the office management in recent years. She appeared to be in her early 40s, tall and slender. Her posture upright with the quiet discipline of someone accustomed to keeping order in small spaces. Her hair was a soft chestnut brown gathered into a low bun at the base of her neck, and thin reading glasses rested on a silver chain around her collar. Her skin was pale in the winter light, and her expression carried that careful professionalism people used when dealing with grief. When she saw Nolan, she stood. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was calm but measured. "I'm sorry for your loss." Nolan nodded once. "Thank you." Sarah glanced briefly at Keir before gesturing toward the hallway. "We're ready." The conference room was already occupied. A few relatives Nolan recognized by name but not by memory sat around the table, distant cousins who had drifted away long ago. 2 elderly residents from the town also sat near the far end, their presence suggesting curiosity more than obligation. At the head of the table sat Daniel Whitaker. The lawyer was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s. His thinning gray hair was combed neatly back, and a trimmed mustache framed a mouth that rarely smiled unless necessary. He wore a dark wool suit that had clearly served him many winters. Daniel stood when Nolan entered. "Nolan," he said, extending a firm hand. Nolan shook it. His grip was strong but brief, the way soldiers learned to shake hands when time mattered. They sat. Keir lay down beside Nolan's chair. The will was read without ceremony. Property, savings, a few personal items. Names were called. People nodded. It continued like that for several minutes until Daniel Whitaker paused. His eyes lifted slightly above the document. "To my nephew," he read slowly. "Nolan Mercer, I leave the Mercer house located on the North Ridge overlooking White Harbor Bay, along with the surrounding property and its contents." The room went quiet. Then someone chuckled softly. Another cousin leaned back in their chair. A woman whispered something that sounded suspiciously like relief. Nolan didn't react. Across the floor, Keir lifted his head. His ears angled forward, not toward the people, toward the door behind the lawyer. Daniel continued reading. "And 1 iron key belonging to the Mercer property." A small wooden box was placed on the table. Inside lay a single old iron key, dark with age. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped across the floor. People offered brief condolences that required no response. No one asked Nolan what he planned to do with the house. Outside, the air had grown colder. Nolan stepped onto the sidewalk. Keir moved beside him immediately, shoulder brushing lightly against Nolan's leg. A voice spoke behind him. "You helped her once." Nolan turned. The speaker was Harold Pike. Harold was 72 but carried himself with the stubborn strength of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. His hair was silver and thick beneath a gray wool beanie, and a short beard the color of ash framed his weathered face. He wore a red flannel shirt beneath a faded denim jacket and heavy work pants stained faintly with grease. Harold studied Nolan with pale blue eyes that missed very little. "You drove someone down to the harbor," he said. Nolan frowned slightly. Harold continued. "Woman and a little girl. Late at night." The memory surfaced slowly. 18 years old, snow falling, his aunt asking him to drive someone to the pier without questions. At the time, Nolan had assumed it was family business. Harold nodded once. "Your aunt never forgot that." He turned and walked away before Nolan could ask anything else. Keir suddenly stopped, not abruptly but with the deliberate stillness of a dog who had just noticed something important. His body aligned toward the frozen bay, the dog's ears rose sharply. For a second, Nolan felt it too. Not a sound, not movement, just the faint sensation of being noticed. Keir let out a low, uncertain breath. Then he pressed his shoulder gently against Nolan's leg. The moment passed, but the feeling did not entirely leave. That night, Nolan stayed at the roadside motel near the edge of town. The room was small. The heater rattled against the wall. Snow gathered slowly against the window. Nolan sat on the edge of the bed with the iron key turning slowly between his fingers. He could not remember the last time he had thought about the Mercer house, or about his aunt. Across the room, Keir stood near the window. The German shepherd's silhouette was sharp against the pale glow of the frozen bay beyond the glass. The dog did not bark, did not pace. He simply watched the distant shoreline, as if he expected something to return the gaze. Nolan lay back on the bed, eyes on the ceiling. For years he had lived in places where danger announced itself clearly. This felt different, quieter, more patient. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen water. Keir remained at the window, watching, waiting, as if the house on the ridge had already begun calling them home. Morning in White Harbor arrived quietly. The snow from the night before had settled into a thin silver crust across the ground, and the pale winter sun crept slowly above the line of distant tree. The air carried the stillness that often followed a cold night near the lake, sharp, silent, almost expectant. Nolan Mercer left the motel just after sunrise. He had slept, though not deeply. Years in the military had trained his body to rest when it could, but his mind rarely let go completely. The iron key from the will sat in his jacket pocket, heavier than it should have been for something so small. Keir jumped into the truck before Nolan even opened the passenger door fully. The German shepherd settled into the seat with practiced ease, the black harness with red trim snug around his chest. His ears remained upright, scanning the morning sounds of the quiet town. They drove north. The road leading to the Mercer property climbed gradually along the edge of the frozen bay. Pine trees pressed closer to the road here, their tall trunks forming dark pillars in the pale morning light. Nolan slowed the truck as the narrow lane appeared. Snow covered most of the ground, but not evenly. There were tire tracks, not fresh but recent enough that the edges had not yet softened beneath new snowfall. Someone had been here. Nolan parked near the old iron gate. The gate itself leaned slightly inward, rusted along the hinges but not broken. The metal posts were anchored in thick stone walls that curved around the property. Keir jumped down from the truck and stood still for a moment. The dog lifted his head and inhaled the cold air deeply. His body remained relaxed, not threatened, just attentive. Nolan pushed the gate open with a low, metallic groan. Beyond it stood the Mercer house. The structure rose from the slope overlooking the frozen bay like something built to endure weather rather than impress people. Large blocks of lakestone formed the walls, stacked thick and precise. The roof sloped sharply to shed snow, its dark shingles dusted white. It wasn't new, but it was far from abandoned. The windows were intact. The steps were clear of deep snow. Even from a distance, Nolan could see something that didn't belong in a forgotten house. Order. Keir walked ahead of him toward the front porch. The wooden boards creaked beneath Nolan's boots as he climbed the steps. He took the iron key from his pocket. The lock resisted at first, as if remembering years of silence. Then it turned. The door opened inward with a slow, wooden sigh. Cool air drifted out to meet them. Inside, light from the tall windows spread across the wide entry room. Nolan stepped inside carefully. The first thing he noticed was the floor. Dust existed, but not much. Not enough for a house that had supposedly been empty for years. Keir padded across the stone floor, nails clicking softly. The dog paused near the center of the room, scanning the corners. His tail remained low and steady. No alarm, just investigation. The living room sat beyond the entryway. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Nolan crouched briefly to inspect it. The ashes inside were old but not ancient, gray and thin rather than thick and packed. Someone had used this fireplace within the past year. The couch carried folded blankets, neatly arranged. In the kitchen, Nolan found cabinets containing basic supplies: flour, salt, tea, nothing fresh but nothing rotten either. Someone had maintained the place. Keir suddenly turned his head toward the back door. The dog's ears angled sharply. Footsteps approached outside. Nolan stepped toward the doorway just as it opened. A woman stood there holding a small animal carrier. She froze when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman was in her mid-30s, perhaps a little younger. She stood about 5'7", her posture balanced and confident in the way of someone used to moving outdoors in winter conditions. Her hair was chestnut brown, tied low at the base of her neck, strands escaping slightly around her temples. Her skin held a natural warmth despite the cold weather, and her green eyes carried a calm alertness. She wore a moss-green canvas jacket, thick and weatherproof. Over a cream-colored sweater, dark jeans disappeared into sturdy brown winter boots dusted with snow. The animal carrier in her hands shifted slightly. Inside it, a young red fox lay curled in a blanket. The fox blinked slowly. "Sorry," the woman said first. Her voice was soft but steady. "I didn't expect anyone here." Nolan straightened. "Neither did I." She stepped into the doorway slowly. "I'm Elena Vossler." Her gaze dropped briefly toward Keir. The German shepherd stood motionless, watching her, evaluating. Elena crouched slightly, not reaching for the dog but lowering herself enough to appear less threatening. Keir studied her for several seconds. Then his tail gave a small, deliberate movement. Approval. Elena smiled faintly. "Well," she said, "that helps." She stepped inside and set the carrier gently on the kitchen table. "The fox got caught in a trap up near the ridge," she explained. "I run the veterinary clinic in town. Sometimes I treat wildlife when I can." The fox inside the crate shifted again. Young, thin, but alive. Elena checked the latch on the carrier before turning back toward Nolan. "So you're the one who inherited the place?" Nolan nodded. "You've heard about that already?" Elena shrugged lightly. "In a town this small," she said, "everything travels faster than snow." She looked around the room slowly. Her expression held something more complicated than curiosity. "People always said this house kept secrets." "What kind of secrets?" Nolan asked. She hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "That part was never clear." Her gaze moved toward the wide windows facing the frozen bay. "They just said the Mercer house sometimes kept people safe." Keir suddenly stiffened, not aggressively but with intense focus. The dog walked toward the far wall of the living room. He lowered his nose to the floorboards and sniffed carefully along the edge of the wall. Then he stopped. One paw lifted slightly as he pressed his nose against a narrow seam in the wooden paneling. Elena watched the dog curiously. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. Nolan stepped closer. Keir looked back at him. Not confused, not alarmed, certain. as if he had just discovered something that had been waiting there for a very long time. Nolan examined the wall. The paneling appeared solid at first glance, but when he ran his hand across the wood, he felt it. A slight gap, a hidden edge. He pushed gently. The panel shifted inward. Behind it was a narrow cavity containing a small wooden box. The box was simple but carefully made. Dust covered its surface, but not enough to hide the fact that it had been placed there deliberately. Nolan lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. His name was written across the front in steady handwriting. Nolan Mercer. The sight of it tightened something in his chest. Elena leaned slightly closer but said nothing. Nolan opened the letter carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. His aunt's. Nolan, if you are reading this, it means you came back. And if you came back, it means the house finally has someone who will listen. Before you believe what the town says, walk through every room, look carefully. This house was never meant to frighten anyone. It was meant to hold what others could not. Nolan read the last line twice. He lowered the letter slowly. Elena studied his face. What did it say? Nolan folded the paper. My aunt expected me. Elena's brow furrowed slightly. She knew you'd come back? That's not the strange part. He glanced down at Keir, then back at the letter. She also knew I'd bring the dog. Elena's eyes moved toward Keir again. The German shepherd now lay calmly on the floor beside the open panel, watching, waiting, as if the house itself had finally acknowledged their arrival. The Mercer house had a different kind of quiet in the afternoon. Not the hollow silence of an abandoned building, but the patient stillness of a place that had once been busy and had simply paused instead of ending. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows facing the frozen bay, laying pale strips of light across the stone floor and the wooden shelves lining the walls. Nolan Mercer stood in the library. The room had likely been his aunt's favorite. The walls were filled with bookshelves that stretched nearly to the ceiling, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of hands brushing past them. Some books leaned at odd angles, others were stacked with deliberate care. Dust floated slowly in the air. Keir lay near the doorway, his large body relaxed but his eyes alert, the way working dogs often rested without ever fully switching off. The German shepherd's black and tan coat caught the pale light, highlighting the powerful lines of his shoulders and the calm intelligence in his amber eyes. Elena Vossler stood beside the wide desk near the center of the room. She had taken off her canvas jacket and draped it over the back of a chair. Without it, the cream sweater she wore made her look less like someone who spent her days outdoors treating injured animals, and more like someone who belonged in a quiet academic office. Her posture was straight, though the way she held the folder in her hands suggested she was trying not to let her thoughts race ahead of her. Nolan opened another drawer in the desk. Inside he found more documents, carefully arranged, labeled, and preserved. Maps, letters, and photographs. Some of the photos were decades old, their colors fading into the muted tones of time. One showed the Mercer house in summer surrounded by bright green grass instead of snow. Another captured the harbor before modern docks had been built. But others were stranger. They were photographs of people, men, women, children. Each picture had a small note attached, dates, short sentences, nothing elaborate. Elena leaned closer to read one. She arrived with 2 children, she murmured. No identification. Stayed 4 weeks. Another note read, former Marine, night terrors severe, left for Montana. Nolan flipped through the stack slowly. These aren't family records, he said quietly. No, Elena replied. These are cases. They began to understand the pattern. The folders were organized by year, Each contained information about people who had arrived quietly in White Harbor and left just as quietly. Some were women fleeing violent partners. Some were veterans struggling with invisible wounds. Others were children brought by relatives who feared someone might be searching for them. Every file ended the same way, left safely. Nolan sat down in the chair behind the desk. For a moment, he simply stared at the documents. My aunt was hiding people. Elena shook her head slightly. Not hiding, she said. Protecting. Nolan picked up a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked with age, the edges darkened by years of use. He opened to the first page. The handwriting was careful and deliberate. His aunt's voice came through the words clearly. White Harbor does not need to know everything. Sometimes safety requires quiet. He flipped further through the pages. Certain entries appeared again and again. 3 names repeated throughout the journal. Harold Pike, Martha Ellison, Samuel Rourke. Elena noticed the pattern too. That's not coincidence. Nolan nodded. Looks like a team. He turned to another page. Near the top, written in bold letters, was a phrase. Harbor Circle. Elena frowned slightly. That sounds like a group. Probably was, Nolan said. He continued reading. Harbor Circle had existed for more than 30 years. 3 people had helped Nolan's aunt run the house as a discreet refuge for those who needed time to disappear from dangerous situations. Harold Pike had supplied tools, fuel, and repairs through his hardware store. Martha Ellison had provided medical care. Samuel Rourke, who had been the town's sheriff years earlier, had quietly redirected attention whenever questions arose. Nolan leaned back slowly in the chair. Small-town conspiracy. Elena smiled faintly. Small-town compassion. Keir stood abruptly. The German shepherd's ears shot forward as if he had heard something beyond the range of human hearing. Without looking back, he walked toward the window facing the frozen bay. His nose pressed against the glass. His tail lowered, not in fear but in concentration. Nolan followed the dog's gaze. Down near the shoreline, partly hidden by the slope of the land, stood the remains of an old wooden dock. Weathered planks stretched out across the frozen water like broken ribs. Keir stared at it as if something about that place demanded attention. Then the dog looked back at Nolan, and for a moment the meaning in his eyes was unmistakable. There. Elena noticed the exchange. What is it? She asked. Nolan shrugged lightly. He thinks something's important down there. Elena glanced out the window toward the dock. That pier hasn't been used in years. But something about the way she said it suggested she wasn't entirely certain. Nolan closed the journal and stood. We'll check it later. For now, there were still more documents to examine. They continued sorting through the folders. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the frozen bay into a sheet of white light. Eventually, Elena opened a thinner folder tucked near the bottom of the stack. At first, she didn't react. She simply stared at the first page. Then her shoulders stiffened. Nolan noticed immediately. What is it? Elena didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned the folder so he could see. The name written across the top of the page was simple. Claire Vossler. Nolan looked up slowly. Elena's eyes had gone distant. My mother, she said. The words came out quietly, as if saying them too loudly might disturb something fragile. Elena sat down slowly in the chair beside the desk. Her fingers traced the edge of the folder without opening it again. When I was 8, she said, my mom disappeared for almost 3 months. Nolan listened without interrupting. She told everyone she had gone to stay with relatives in Duluth, Elena continued. But I remember the night she left. Her voice softened. She packed one small bag and told me I'd be staying with my aunt for a while. Elena swallowed slightly. She came back later. Thinner, quieter. She tapped the folder gently. She never told me why. Nolan opened the file. Inside were several handwritten notes. One read, Claire Vossler arrived late evening. No injuries but extremely distressed. Safe for now. Another note appeared several pages later. Situation resolved. Claire leaving town under new employment arrangement. Nolan closed the folder carefully. Elena looked toward the window. So my mother was one of them. Looks like it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, wind moved across the frozen surface of the bay. Keir returned from the window and lay beside Nolan's chair again. The dog seemed calmer now, as if simply acknowledging the place he had noticed was enough for the moment. Nolan glanced down at him. "You're full of surprises," he muttered. Elena managed a faint smile. "You trust him that much? More than most people." She nodded slowly. That might be wise. They sat in silence for a few minutes, absorbing what they had learned. The Mercer house was not a relic. It had been an operation, a quiet network built on trust and secrecy. And now, somehow, Nolan had inherited it. He looked around the library again. The shelves, the desk, the journals. All of it suddenly felt less like history and more like responsibility. Outside, the frozen bay stretched wide beneath the pale sky. And far below the house, the old dock waited quietly against the ice. By late afternoon, the light over White Harbor had softened into a pale winter glow. The frozen bay stretched wide and silent beneath the hill where the Mercer house stood. From the tall windows of the library, Nolan Mercer could see the old dock clearly now, its skeletal frame extending out across the ice like the bones of something long forgotten. For hours, he and Elena had sorted through the documents in the library. The journals had revealed fragments of the past, but none of them explained the specific note that kept appearing in the margins of several pages. Night at the dock, 24 years ago. That phrase had been written in the same careful handwriting as the rest of Nolan's aunt's journal. But unlike the other entries, the explanation was missing. Nolan slipped the journal closed. "I think we should go take a look," he said. Elena stood beside the window, arms folded loosely as she stared down toward the shoreline. The winter light made her green eyes appear brighter than usual. She was thoughtful by nature. Nolan had already noticed that. Not the kind of person who jumped to conclusions, but the kind who turned things over carefully until they made sense. "You're thinking the dock is where this started," she said, "or where it ended?" Keir was already standing by the door. The German shepherd seemed to understand the shift in direction before either of them moved. His black saddle coat caught the pale light from the hallway, and the muscles along his shoulders flexed easily as he turned his head toward Nolan. When Nolan opened the front door, the cold air rushed inside. Keir stepped out first. The dog moved with quiet confidence down the slope behind the house. His paws found solid ground even where snow had drifted deep, his body balanced and alert. Nolan and Elena followed. The slope leading toward the bay was steeper than it looked from above. Snow clung to the tall grass that poked through the frozen ground, and the wind coming off the lake cut through clothing with surprising sharpness. Elena pulled her canvas jacket tighter around herself. "You know," she said after a moment, "I've lived here my whole life." Nolan glanced sideways. "And you've never been down here?" She shook her head. "Not really. People don't come this far out unless they're fishing in summer." They reached the edge of the shoreline. The dock was older than Nolan had expected. The wooden planks were gray with age, some warped by decades of weather. Several boards had broken away entirely, leaving jagged gaps where the lake had claimed its share of the structure. But something about the dock still suggested use. The rope tied around one of the posts looked newer than the rest of the wood. Nolan crouched beside it. The fibers were stiff with cold but not brittle. Someone had tied it there recently. Elena noticed the same thing. That's not old. No. Keir walked slowly along the edge of the dock. The dog lowered his nose and began tracing careful paths across the frozen ground. Nolan watched him for several seconds before noticing something else. Footprints. Faint, but visible. The tracks led from the tree line down toward the dock. They were partially covered by fresh snow, but enough remained to reveal their shape. Boot prints. Large, adult. Elena followed Nolan's gaze. Someone's been here. Nolan stood slowly. More than once. They moved along the edge of the dock. The frozen surface of the bay creaked softly beneath the shifting ice, the sound echoing across the wide open water. Halfway down the dock, Nolan stopped. A rusted metal ring was bolted into one of the posts. Attached to it was a broken chain. He bent closer to inspect it. This held a boat once. Elena nodded. Probably years ago. But Nolan wasn't so sure. The chain had been snapped, not rusted through. Something had broken it. Keir suddenly froze. The German shepherd stood near the far end of the dock, his body rigid with attention, his ears angled forward sharply. Then he stepped sideways and began pawing lightly at a patch of snow near the base of one of the posts. Nolan walked over. "What is it?" Keir continued digging. Within seconds, the dog uncovered something buried beneath the snow. A small metal container. Old, cold, partially rusted. Nolan knelt and brushed the remaining snow away. The lid was loose. Inside were several folded sheets of waterproof paper. Elena leaned closer. "What is that?" Nolan unfolded the top page carefully. The ink had faded slightly, but the writing was still legible. At the top of the page were 4 words. Dock incident. Confidential below, that was a date. 24 years ago, Nolan read quickly, his expression tightened. Elena watched his face carefully. "What does it say?" He handed her the paper. Elena read silently, her brow furrowed deeper with every line. According to the document, a small cargo boat had been operating illegally along the northern side of the bay that winter. The vessel had been transporting smuggled equipment across the Canadian border under cover of darkness. But something had gone wrong. During one of the nighttime transfers, the boat had struck ice near the dock. The hull had split. One man had drowned. Several others had escaped to shore. Witnesses had seen the accident from the hillside above. Those witnesses had later come to the Mercer house. Elena lowered the paper slowly. "So your aunt hid them." "Protected them," Nolan said quietly. Elena nodded. "But if that smuggling operation was real..." She glanced back toward the shoreline. "Who was running it?" A voice answered from behind them. "People who had more money than sense." Both Nolan and Elena turned. A man stood at the edge of the slope leading down from the trees. He was tall, around Nolan's height, but broader through the shoulders. His hair was dark with streaks of gray at the temples, styled neatly despite the wind. The heavy charcoal coat he wore was expensive, cut sharply across his frame. His name was Graham Heller, the kind of man who carried himself with quiet authority, the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. His face was clean-shaven, his jaw strong but slightly softened by age. His eyes, however, held something sharper, an alertness that suggested he noticed more than he revealed. Elena straightened slightly. "Heller?" Graham gave a polite smile. "Elena." His gaze shifted toward Nolan. "You must be Mercer." Nolan didn't answer immediately. Graham stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching lightly in the snow. "I was hoping we'd meet." His tone remained friendly, too friendly. I hear you inherited the house. Looks that way. Graham nodded thoughtfully. I'm buying land around the bay. He gestured toward the frozen water. Planning a winter resort, fishing lodges, cabins. Elena crossed her arms. You mean the same project the town council hasn't approved yet? Graham smiled faintly. Progress takes time. Then his eyes returned to Nolan. I'd like to buy the Mercer property. Nolan shook his head immediately. Not for sale. Graham seemed unsurprised. I expected that answer. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small business card. My offer will stand if you reconsider. He placed the card in Nolan's hand. Then he turned and began walking back toward the tree line. After several steps, he stopped and glanced back over his shoulder. One more thing, he said calmly. Some stories around here are better left buried. The wind carried his words across the frozen shoreline. Then he disappeared into the trees. Elena watched the spot where he had stood. I don't trust him. Nolan looked down at the document in his hand. Neither did my aunt. Keir walked slowly back along the dock and sat beside Nolan. The dog's eyes followed the direction Graham had gone, and though the shoreline had fallen quiet again, the tension in the air had not. Nolan folded the document carefully. The cold wind moved across the bay once more, and somewhere beyond the trees someone else was still paying attention. The storm arrived faster than anyone in White Harbor expected. By mid-afternoon, the sky had already turned the dull gray color that meant heavy snow was coming. The wind shifted first, rising from the northern edge of the bay and sweeping across the frozen water in long, restless gusts. Nolan Mercer stood near the tall windows of the Mercer house, watching the clouds thicken above the lake. Beside him, Keir sat upright, the German shepherd's ears angled toward the distant shoreline. The dog's posture was calm but alert, his amber eyes tracking the changing light with quiet attention. You feel that too? Nolan murmured. Keir's tail moved once. The house behind them was warm. Old stone walls held heat well, and the fireplace in the living room crackled steadily. Elena Vossler moved between the kitchen and the hallway, checking supplies they had found earlier in the day. She had tied her chestnut hair back again, though loose strands now framed her face from the wind outside. Her moss-green canvas jacket hung from the back of a chair, while she worked in the cream sweater beneath it. I just heard from town, she said, returning from the kitchen. Power lines already went down near Harbor Street. Nolan nodded. The wind rattled the windows slightly as if confirming her words. If the storm gets worse, Elena continued, people are going to need somewhere warm. Nolan glanced around the house. The Mercer home was built for northern winters. Thick stone walls, narrow window frames, and a large basement that had once been stocked carefully for long, cold seasons. Then a truck engine sounded outside. Nolan opened the door just as a pickup rolled slowly up the narrow lane. The driver stepped out with the careful movements of someone accustomed to ice and uneven ground. Harold Pike approached the porch. The older man looked almost exactly as Nolan remembered from the law office, though the wind had reddened his cheeks and dusted his gray wool cap with snow. His flannel shirt showed beneath a heavy canvas coat this time, and his beard carried small white flecks of frost. He climbed the steps without hesitation. I figured you'd be here, Harold said. Nolan stepped aside to let him in. You drove through this storm? Harold shrugged. Been driving these roads longer than you've been alive. Inside the warmth of the house, Harold removed his gloves and glanced around the room. His eyes moved over the walls, the furniture, the fireplace. For a moment his expression softened. She kept it the same. Elena watched him curiously. You knew Nolan's aunt well? Harold gave a quiet nod. Long enough. Then he looked toward the hallway leading downstairs. Generator still works? Nolan raised an eyebrow. You know about that too? Harold gave a faint smile. Kid, I'm the one who installed half the things in this house. He walked toward the basement door and opened it with practiced familiarity. I promised your aunt I'd keep the place running as long as I could. Nolan followed him downstairs. The basement smelled faintly of oil and metal. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stocked with supplies. Blankets, canned food, lanterns, batteries. In the far corner stood the generator. Harold crouched beside it and ran his hand along the side. Well, I'll be damned, he said. She kept it in good shape. Within minutes, the generator roared to life, the low mechanical hum vibrating through the floor above them. Back upstairs, Elena felt the lights brighten slightly. That's a good sign. Outside, the wind grew louder. Snow began falling in thick, slanted sheets. Then the phone in Elena's pocket buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Clinic lost power, she said quietly. And the diner, too. Nolan looked toward the front door. They're going to need a place to go. Elena met his gaze. The decision was already forming in both their minds. Nolan stepped onto the porch and looked out toward the distant town lights. Several had already gone dark. He turned back inside. We're opening the house. Harold nodded immediately. That's what it's for. Within an hour, the first people began arriving. A battered pickup truck pulled up the lane carrying 3 elderly residents wrapped in heavy coats. Another vehicle arrived soon after with 2 families whose homes had lost heat. The Mercer house filled quickly. Martha Ellison arrived not long after. She stepped through the doorway with the steady authority of someone used to emergency situations. Martha was nearing 70 but moved with remarkable efficiency. Her short silver hair framed a lined but composed face, and her clear gray eyes scanned the room with clinical precision. She had once been the town's nurse for more than 3 decades. Looks like we're back to work, she said calmly. Within minutes, Martha had organized a small medical station in the living room. Elena joined her, treating frost-bitten fingers and checking on older residents who had trouble breathing in the cold air. Meanwhile, Harold maintained the generator and heating system downstairs. Another man arrived soon after, Daniel Cross. Daniel was a tall, thin schoolteacher in his early 40s whose sandy hair always seemed slightly uncombed, as if he spent too much time thinking about books instead of mirrors. His glasses slid down his nose whenever he spoke, and his calm, patient demeanor made him well loved among the town's children. He brought 6 kids with him from the elementary school. The buses got stuck, he explained. I figured the Mercer place might be safer. Soon the living room filled with quiet conversation and nervous laughter. Some of the older residents moved slowly through the house, touching the furniture and walls as if they were remembering something. One elderly woman stood near the fireplace, tears forming in her eyes. I stayed here once, she whispered to Elena. Years ago. Elena squeezed her hand gently. You're safe here again. Keir suddenly lifted his head. The German shepherd had been lying beside the door, quietly observing the growing crowd. Now his ears snapped forward. Without hesitation, he stood and moved toward Nolan. The dog nudged Nolan's leg sharply, once, then again. Nolan understood immediately. Someone's outside. He grabbed his coat. Stay here, he told Elena. Snow blasted against his face the moment he stepped onto the porch. Visibility had dropped dramatically. Keir pushed past him into the storm. The dog moved confidently through the swirling snow, following a scent Nolan could not see. They reached the edge of the slope leading toward the frozen bay. There, half buried in the snow near the old dock road, lay a figure. An old man. Nolan knelt beside him quickly. The man's skin was pale and cold, his breath shallow. He looked to be in his late 70s. Thin white hair clung to his head beneath a wool cap. Sir, Nolan said firmly. The man stirred weakly. Couldn't find the road. Keir stood beside them, his body shielding the man from the wind. Nolan lifted the old man carefully. Let's get you inside. Back at the house, the storm worsened. Snow piled against the windows and the wind howled through the trees surrounding the property. Inside, however, warmth and light filled every room. Blankets covered couches, children slept near the fireplace. Martha moved steadily between patients while Elena prepared hot soup in the kitchen. Daniel Cross told quiet stories to keep the youngest children calm. Harold returned from the basement, wiping oil from his hands. Generators holding, he said. Nolan stood in the doorway watching the room. For the first time since arriving in White Harbor, the Mercer house no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like something alive, something that had waited a long time to be used again. Across the room, Keir finally lay down near the fireplace. The German shepherd stretched his paws forward and rested his head between them. For the first time that day, his eyes closed. Outside, the storm raged across the frozen bay, but inside the Mercer house, the lights stayed on. And for the first time in many years, the house was doing exactly what it had been built to do. The storm left White Harbor slowly. By morning, the sky had cleared into a pale, fragile blue, and sunlight stretched across the frozen bay in long sheets of silver light. Snowbanks lined the streets, piled high against fences and porches, and the town moved carefully as if waking from a deep sleep. Inside the Mercer house, the air was warm and quiet. Many of the people who had taken shelter the night before had already begun returning to their homes. A few elderly residents remained in the living room, wrapped in blankets, while Martha Ellison checked their pulse and breathing with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent her entire career managing fragile situations. Nolan Mercer stood near the window overlooking the bay. His gray-blue eyes followed the slow movement of the town below. Utility trucks crawled along Harbor Street like patient insects, restoring power line by line. Behind him, Keir lay stretched across the rug near the fireplace. The German shepherd looked relaxed for the first time since they had arrived in White Harbor days earlier. His ears twitched occasionally at distant sounds, but his body remained loose, his head resting on his paws. The house had fulfilled its purpose during the storm, but Nolan knew the real question had only begun. Elena Vossler approached from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. The warmth rising from them filled the air with the comforting smell of roasted beans. She handed one to Nolan. Her green eyes studied his face carefully. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't." She nodded slightly as if that answer was expected. The previous night had changed something in the house, not physically, but in the way the town looked at it. People had stepped through its doors with hesitation and left with something closer to relief. And now those same people were talking, which meant the story of the Mercer house would not stay quiet for long. A car engine sounded outside. Nolan glanced toward the driveway. A dark sedan stopped near the front gate. The man stepping out wore a long charcoal overcoat that moved sharply in the cold wind. Graham Heller. Even from a distance, his posture carried the confidence of someone used to controlling situations. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly back, and his face remained clean-shaven despite the biting wind. Elena's shoulders stiffened. "He's back." Nolan set the coffee cup down. "Of course he is." A moment later, Graham knocked. When Nolan opened the door, Graham offered the same calm smile he had worn near the dock days earlier. "I heard you hosted half the town last night." His tone sounded polite, but his eyes moved past Nolan into the house, calculating. "That was generous." Nolan crossed his arms. "Storm didn't give people much choice." Graham stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He glanced briefly around the living room where several residents still rested. "Impressive place," he said. Then he removed a folded envelope from his coat. "This arrived at the county office this morning." He handed it to Nolan. The letter bore the seal of a legal firm from Duluth. Elena leaned slightly closer as Nolan opened it. Inside was a notice, a formal request to review ownership records of the Mercer property and the surrounding land. Nolan read it twice. "Legal pressure," he said quietly. Graham spread his hands. "Just standard procedure when valuable land changes hands." Elena frowned. "That seems fast." Graham smiled faintly. "Investors prefer clarity." Then he leaned slightly closer to Nolan, particularly when certain historical matters might complicate development. The words hung in the air for a moment. Nolan folded the letter. "You're worried about something." Graham's smile didn't change. "I'm cautious." He turned toward the door. "Enjoy your house, Mr. Mercer." Then he left. The sound of his car fading down the road left the room quieter than before. Elena exhaled slowly. "He's scared of something." Nolan nodded. "And he thinks it's here." That afternoon, Harold Pike returned. The older man brushed snow from his coat before stepping inside. His pale blue eyes studied Nolan carefully, as if measuring the weight of the situation. "I heard Heller's already making moves," Harold said. Nolan handed him the legal notice. Harold read it slowly. Then he sighed. "Your aunt knew this day might come." He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small cassette tape on the table. "I found this in my workshop yesterday." The plastic casing looked old. The label carried a single word written in careful ink. Nolan and Elena glanced between the two men. "Is that—" Harold nodded. "Your aunt recorded it years ago." Nolan stared at the tape. For several seconds he didn't move. Then he found an old cassette player among the shelves in the library. The tape clicked into place. The soft mechanical whir filled the room. Then a voice emerged, his aunt's voice. Calm, steady. "If you're listening to this, Nolan, it means the house has chosen you." Nolan leaned forward slightly. Keir lifted his head from the rug. The voice continued. "The Mercer house was never meant to hide the truth forever. It was meant to protect the people who survived it." The tape crackled softly. 24 years ago, a man named Victor Heller used the frozen bay to move stolen equipment across the border. Elena's eyes widened. Victor Heller, Graham's father. The accident at the dock was not an accident. The boat struck the ice after the crew tried to force witnesses off the shore. Nolan's jaw tightened. The tape continued. "Some of those witnesses came to this house. They were frightened and hunted. I gave them time to disappear." Elena lowered her gaze slowly. "My mother," she whispered. The voice on the tape softened. "I kept records not for revenge, but in case someone tried to change the story." Truth is powerful, Nolan, but truth can also destroy people who never deserved the storm. The tape clicked briefly. Then the final words came. "You must decide what to do with it, but remember this. Justice is not always the same as exposure." The recording ended. Silence filled the library. Keir stood. Without hesitation, the German shepherd walked toward the hallway where the study door stood slightly open. He paused there, looking back at Nolan, not barking, not agitated, simply waiting, as if reminding him that the house still held more answers than the tape alone could offer. Elena broke the silence first. "So that's it." Her voice trembled slightly despite her effort to stay calm. "Your aunt hid witnesses so Heller's father couldn't silence them." Nolan nodded. "And now Graham wants those records gone." Elena walked slowly toward the window. The frozen bay stretched out below them, quiet and deceptively peaceful. My mom never told me any of this. She probably couldn't, Nolan said. Elena turned. So what do we do? Her eyes held a mixture of anger and uncertainty. Do we tell the whole town? Nolan thought carefully before answering. If we expose everything, he said slowly, those people your mother helped disappear will be dragged back into it. Elena crossed her arms. But if we stay silent, Heller wins. Nolan nodded. That's the problem. For several minutes they said nothing. The house creaked softly around them, adjusting to the warmth inside. Finally, Elena spoke again. There has to be another way. Nolan looked toward the shelves where the journals and records rested. Maybe there is. He stepped toward the desk. We don't need to expose everyone. Elena watched him carefully. What are you thinking? We release enough information to stop Heller from rewriting history, but keep the identities protected. Elena considered that. Slowly, she nodded. That's fair. Keir returned to his place beside the fireplace. The German shepherd settled down quietly, as if satisfied that the conversation had finally reached the point the house had been waiting for. Outside, the last snow from the storm slid slowly from the roof, and somewhere beyond the trees the frozen bay held the echoes of a story that was finally beginning to surface. Winter settled gently over White Harbor after the storm. The town had begun to move again, slowly, cautiously, like a place remembering its rhythm after being shaken awake. Snowbanks lined the roads and sunlight reflected across the frozen bay in bright sheets that made the entire harbor shimmer during the day. But something else had changed too. The Mercer house was no longer just a quiet structure standing on the ridge above the water. People were talking about it now, and this time the tone of those conversations was different. Inside the library, Nolan Mercer sat at the long wooden desk surrounded by stacks of folders and journals that had once belonged to his aunt. The leather-bound records of Harbor Circle lay open beside him, their pages filled with careful handwriting documenting decades of quiet protection. Across the room, Elena Vossler leaned against the window frame, arms crossed lightly as she watched the frozen bay. Her chestnut hair was tied loosely behind her neck, and the pale winter light caught the green of her eyes as she studied the horizon. She had always been thoughtful by nature, but in the past few days her expression had deepened with something else. Resolve. On the floor beside Nolan's chair, Keir rested calmly. The German shepherd stretched his long front legs forward, his powerful frame relaxed yet attentive. His black and tan coat glowed warmly in the sunlight spilling through the windows, and every now and then his ears twitched at distant sounds drifting up from the town below. He had become something of a familiar figure to the people of White Harbor. Children who passed the house on their way home from school often slowed to watch him standing near the fence. Keir tolerated their attention with the quiet patience of a dog who understood his place. Nolan closed one of the folders and leaned back. It's ready. Elena turned. You're sure? He nodded. We release enough of the records to show what happened at the dock. But we leave out the names. Elena stepped closer to the desk. Harold already spoke to the county lawyer, she said. They'll accept the documents as evidence if we file them properly. Nolan slid a small stack of papers across the table. These show Victor Heller's smuggling operation, the accident, and the intimidation afterward. Elena studied the documents carefully. That's enough to stop Graham's development project. Nolan's expression remained calm. That's the idea. They drove into town that afternoon. The courthouse in White Harbor was a modest brick building that had stood near the harbor for nearly a century. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and paper. The lawyer reviewing the documents was a man named Patrick Lowell. Patrick was in his mid-50s, a tall man with narrow shoulders and thinning blonde hair that he combed carefully across the top of his head. His round glasses rested low on his nose, giving him the habit of peering over them whenever he read something carefully. Despite his slightly distracted appearance, Patrick had a reputation in the county for being thorough. He read the documents in silence. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses and turned a page slowly. Finally he leaned back. "This is significant." Elena sat quietly beside Nolan. Patrick tapped the papers gently. "If these records are authenticated, they show that the smuggling operation was real, and that the incident at the dock was never fully investigated." Nolan nodded. "That's why we're bringing them now." Patrick glanced at the final page. "And you're choosing not to reveal the witnesses." "That's correct." Patrick considered that for a moment. Then he smiled faintly. "Your aunt would approve." As they left the courthouse, Keir suddenly stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. The German shepherd's ears lifted sharply as he stared across the street. Nolan followed the dog's gaze. Standing near the edge of the harbor parking lot was Graham Heller. The businessman leaned against the side of his dark sedan, hands resting calmly in his coat pockets. His posture looked relaxed, but his sharp eyes studied Nolan with unmistakable intensity. For a moment neither man moved. Then Graham gave a small nod. Not hostile, not friendly. Simply acknowledging that the game had changed, he opened the car door, climbed inside, and drove away without another word. Keir remained still for several seconds after the car disappeared. Then the dog relaxed again, as if satisfied that whatever tension had once filled the air between those two men had finally begun to loosen. Within weeks, the county announced an official investigation into the old smuggling records. The announcement alone was enough. Without control of the narrative, Graham Heller's development investors began to withdraw quietly. Plans for the luxury resort along the frozen bay dissolved almost overnight. The Mercer property was no longer just an inconvenient obstacle. It had become a symbol. In town, conversations shifted. At the diner one morning, Harold Pike sat across from Nolan and Elena with a cup of coffee steaming between his rough hands. The older man looked around the room slowly. "You notice something?" Nolan raised an eyebrow. "What?" Harold smiled. "People aren't afraid of that house anymore." Elena followed his gaze. Several residents sitting nearby glanced toward their table with curiosity rather than suspicion. One of them, a middle-aged woman Nolan recognized from the storm shelter night, gave Elena a small wave. Harold nodded. "They're remembering." Later that week, Nolan stood on the wide porch of the Mercer house, watching a small group of volunteers carry supplies inside. The house had changed again, but this time the change felt intentional. The basement had been reorganized into a winter shelter storage area stocked with blankets and emergency heaters. One room upstairs had been converted into a quiet counseling space for veterans, where those struggling with trauma could speak privately. In the backyard, Elena had already begun setting up small enclosures where injured animals could recover before being released back into the wild. Harold and Martha visited regularly. The older nurse had taken it upon herself to train volunteers on basic medical care. Harold inspected every generator wire and heating vent as if the building were still his responsibility. And perhaps, in a way, it was. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Nolan and Elena stood together on the porch. The frozen bay glowed with the deep gold color of winter sunset. Below them, the harbor lights flickered on one by one. Keir lay stretched across the wooden boards between them. The dog's amber eyes followed a group of children walking along the road near the gate. Their boots crunched in the snow as they passed. One of the younger boys stopped and pointed toward the house. "What is that place?" he asked. An older man walking beside them slowed and looked up at the ridge. For a moment he seemed to consider the question carefully. Then he answered, "That house?" His voice carried faintly through the cold air. "That's the place where the lights stay on, when other places go dark." The children looked up toward the porch. Nolan rested his arms against the railing. Elena stood beside him quietly. Below them, the frozen bay reflected the fading sunlight like a sheet of glass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "You're staying, aren't you?" Nolan nodded. "I think the house needs someone." She smiled softly. "And the animals." Nolan glanced at her. "You planning to leave?" Elena shook her head. "Not anymore." Keir lifted his head and looked out across the frozen water. The wind moved gently across the bay, carrying the distant sounds of the town settling into evening. Behind them, the lights of the Mercer house glowed warmly through the windows. For the first time in decades, the house no longer needed to hide its purpose. It simply stood there on the ridge above White Harbor. A promise kept, a refuge that would remain ready whenever the next storm came. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come as thunder from the sky or visions in the clouds. Sometimes they appear quietly through ordinary people who choose to protect others when the world turns away. The story of the Mercer house reminds us of something deeply important. Justice is not always loud and goodness is not always seen. Nolan's aunt did not build monuments or seek praise. She simply kept her door open when someone had nowhere else to go. And because of that quiet courage, lives were protected, families were given a second chance, and a small town was reminded of its humanity. In many ways, this is how God often works in our lives. Not through spectacle, but through small acts of mercy, compassion, and protection. A door that opens when we feel lost. A stranger who helps when we feel alone. A loyal companion who seems to understand what we cannot explain. These moments may seem ordinary, but they are often the gentle fingerprints of God guiding us forward. Keir's instinct, Nolan's decision to stay, Elena's compassion for both people and animals, and the quiet loyalty of Harold and Martha all remind us that goodness spreads when people choose to stand for what is right. Even when it is difficult, even when it requires patience, even when no one is watching. In our everyday lives, we may not live in a stone house above a frozen bay, but we all have the ability to become a place of light for someone else. A kind word, a helping hand, a moment of listening, or a choice to protect someone who is vulnerable can change a life in ways we may never fully see. Maybe the real miracle is not that the Mercer house existed. Maybe the real miracle is that people chose to keep its light burning. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts. What part of the story meant the most to you? Have you ever experienced a moment when someone became a light for you during a difficult time? Your story may inspire someone else who is watching today. Please consider sharing this video with someone who might need encouragement. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from and what message you took from this story. And if you enjoy stories about courage, compassion, and faith in everyday life, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your path, protect your home, and bring light into your life even during the darkest storms. And may you always remember that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can become the miracle someone else has been praying for.